In 1907, deep within the borderlands of Bolivia and Brazil, a British explorer raised his rifle and fired at something he would spend the rest of his life trying to make the world believe. The creature stretched along the muddy bank of the Abuna River. Massive still, and, he would later write, longer than any living serpent science had yet catalogued. He measured it at more than 18 meters. The naturalists back in London laughed. But he never changed his account, not once. The explorer's name was Percy Harrison Fawcett, and the story of what he saw on that river and what eventually swallowed him whole is a story the Amazon has never fully released. He was not a man easily rattled by the unknown. He had spent years mapping the most hostile terrain on Earth, charting rivers that colonial maps simply left blank, negotiating passage through territories where entire expeditions had vanished before him. Yet the creature on the Abuna stayed with him. It lodged itself in that part of his mind where certainty dissolves and obsession takes root. The Amazon keeps its own calendar, not measured in years, but in floods and droughts, in the slow strangling of a tree by its own parasites, in the patient dissolution of stone by root and rain over centuries. It is a place that has been quietly conducting its own civilization for longer than recorded history allows, and it is a place that does not relinquish its truths to those who demand them. What Fawcett suspected, what drove him back to Brazil again and again until the jungle finally refused to return him, was that somewhere beneath that living green roof, a city waited. A city older than Machu Picchu, a city that the forest had decided to keep. The local peoples of the western Amazon basin had always known about giant serpents. Not as mythology, not as cautionary fable, but as living reality. Creatures that commanded the same respect afforded to mountains and storms. The Yakumama, a name spoken with particular care among river communities, translates in some dialects to Mother of the Waters. She is not a monster in the Western tradition. She is a guardian, an ancestral force that predates any human presence on the river, that coils in the deepest channels where the current runs cold and strange, and that surfaces, if the old accounts are to be trusted, only when something sacred is threatened. If mysteries like this draw you in, consider subscribing. The forest keeps more than one secret. The Cobra Grande is her cousin in the oral traditions of other Amazon communities, a serpent that, according to some tellings, is so immense that it can transform into a vessel, a floating island, an unmarked vessel traveling the river system in disguise. Fishermen along the Rio Negro and the tributaries of the Upper Solimoes have spoken of encounters for generations. Not one or two isolated accounts, but a consistent thread, a presence in the deeper waters, a displacement of current that cannot be explained by the known fauna of the river, a shadow that moves against the flow. These are not stories told to frighten children. They are navigational warnings. They are part of a geographic knowledge passed down across centuries that tells river travelers, there are places you do not anchor. There are channels you do not enter after dark. Then there are the drowned villages. Perhaps no feature of Amazonian life underscores the forest's indifference to human permanence more starkly than the annual flood. Each year, the great rivers swell beyond their banks by 10, 15, sometimes 20 meters, transforming the forest floor into an inland sea that stretches for hundreds of kilometers. Communities built on lower ground are abandoned. Families load what they can into canoes and wait on higher land while the water reclaims everything beneath it. And when the water retreats, as it always does eventually, it does not always leave things as it found them. Foundations shift, walls collapse, and sometimes entire communities simply do not return. And in some river communities, the story goes further. They say the great serpent does not simply inhabit the deep channels. It guards what the waters have buried. A drowned settlement, a forgotten city, a place the forest chose to keep. Some of these drowned places are not recent. The Amazon basin holds within its flooded forests the remnants of pre-Columbian settlements that were abandoned centuries before Europeans arrived. Settlements that the jungle swallowed so completely that their existence was considered legend until satellites and LiDAR surveys began to peel back the canopy and reveal what lay beneath. In the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia, a vast savanna that borders the deeper Amazon basin, archaeologists have in recent decades identified the remnants of a complex hydraulic civilization. Raised fields, causeways, fish weirs, earthen mounds rising from flooded plains. A civilization so sophisticated in its management of water that it transformed an almost unlivable flood environment into a thriving agricultural landscape. And then, for reasons that remain debated, it collapsed. The water rose, the causeways sank, and the forest came back, as it always does, as if nothing had ever been built there at all. It's against this backdrop of genuinely lost civilizations, now confirmed by modern technology, of a landscape that actively erases its own history, that Fawcett's obsession begins to seem less like the delusion of a romantic adventurer and more like the intuition of a man who understood something about the Amazon that his contemporaries were not yet ready to accept. He had read the account of a Portuguese document, known informally as Manuscript 512, which described an unnamed explorer's encounter with a ruined city somewhere in the interior of Brazil in 1753. Massive stone gateways, carved inscriptions, streets laid out with geometric precision beneath a jungle that had been slowly reclaiming them for what must have been centuries. The document's author was never identified. The city it described was never found, but Fawcett believed it was real. He called it the City of Z, and in 1925 he went looking for it for the last time. He set out from Cuiabá in April of that year, accompanied by his eldest son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel. The expedition was deliberately small. Fawcett had learned from previous journeys that large parties attracted unwanted attention from isolated tribes and consumed supplies too quickly for extended deep forest travel. He intended to move fast and light, following river systems southeast into the region of Mato Grosso, toward the highlands known locally as Serra do Roncador, the Snoring Mountains. The last confirmed communication came from a small settlement called Dead Horse Camp, a name that Fawcett himself had given the site during a previous expedition after losing an animal there to jungle conditions. In May 1925, a letter from Fawcett reached his wife Nina back in England. He described their progress as good, their spirits as high. He asked her not to send rescue parties if they failed to return. The region was too dangerous, and he did not want more lives risked. After that letter, there was nothing. The silence that followed Percy Fawcett's final letter is one of the most complete disappearances in the history of exploration. No confirmed remains have ever been recovered. No reliable witnesses to his fate have ever come forward. In the decade since 1925, more than 100 people are estimated to have died attempting to find him, a grim testament to the magnetism of the mystery he left behind. The Serra do Roncador, the territory into which he vanished, sits in a region of Mato Grosso that remains among the least documented in all of Brazil. The Xavante people, whose ancestral lands encompass much of this territory, have always regarded this highland region with particular significance. Some researchers who have worked with Xavante communities have noted that their oral traditions speak of places in the interior where outsiders should not go, not out of hostility, but out of protection. Protection of something ancient, something that was old before the Xavante themselves arrived in the region. And what of the serpent? The Yakumama does not appear in Fawcett's official journals as a named entity, but the Anaconda he claimed to have shot on the Abuna in 1907 and the consistent tradition of outsized serpents in Amazonian indigenous testimony weaves itself through his story in ways that are difficult to fully disentangle. Fawcett believed that the Amazon held biological as well as archaeological secrets. He believed that creatures of extraordinary size existed in the deep interior, not as supernatural entities, but as products of an environment so vast and so isolated that evolution had proceeded along paths science had not yet documented. The green anaconda, Eunectes murinus, is the heaviest snake species on Earth. Confirmed specimens have reached lengths of around 7 to 8 meters, with weights exceeding 250 kilograms. These are, by any measure, extraordinary creatures. But Fawcett's 18-meter account is not unique. Indigenous testimonies describing serpents of similar or greater scale appear in the ethnographic records of multiple Amazonian communities, collected by researchers over more than a century, from the upper Orinoco to the Madre de Dios tributaries of Peru. Imagine you are a river trader working the tributaries of the upper Purus in the late 1800s. Your knowledge of the river is intimate and practical. You know which channels flood in March, which sandbars shift position each season, which villages will trade rubber for iron tools. And you have learned, through the kind of slow accumulation of observation that only years of travel provide, that there are stretches of river you do not navigate at night. Not because of rapids or shallows, but because of the thing that moves in the deep center channel after dark. You have never seen it fully. You have seen the wake, a displacement of water inconsistent with any current or known creature, something that moves upstream against the flow with unhurried deliberateness. You do not need a legend to explain it. You simply know. And you pass that knowledge to your son, who passes it to his, and the knowledge accumulates across generations into something that Western researchers, arriving with notebooks and skepticism, will later classify as mythology. The region where the Yakumama tradition is strongest, the upper Amazon basin, the blackwater tributaries of the Rio Negro system, the flooded forests of the Western Solimois, is also the region with the lowest density of scientific biological surveys. This is not coincidence. These are some of the most logistically inaccessible waterways on Earth, channels that are too shallow for research vessels in the dry season, too flooded to navigate safely in the wet season, and consistently surrounded by territory where no road exists within hundreds of kilometers. In the Javari Valley, a protected indigenous territory in the far western Amazon, bordering Peru, the Brazilian government has confirmed the presence of more uncontacted or voluntarily isolated indigenous groups than anywhere else on Earth. The interior of this territory has never been systematically surveyed. Its rivers have not been mapped with modern precision. What lives in its deeper channels is, in the most literal sense, unknown. The question of what the Amazon might still contain, biologically, archaeologically, and in terms of human knowledge systems that have never been contacted by the outside world, is not a romantic fantasy. It is an empirical reality that modern science is only beginning to systematically confront. Large-scale botanical research suggests that the Amazon basin contains thousands upon thousands of tree species, far more than early explorers ever imagined, and that roughly half of the individual trees in the entire basin belong to only 227 of those species, meaning the remaining thousands of species are dramatically rarer and less documented than previously understood. If botanical diversity at this scale remains incompletely catalogued, the implications for zoology are sobering. The Amazon's aquatic systems alone contain more fish species than the entire Atlantic Ocean. New animal species continue to be described in remote regions of the basin, a reminder that even large mammals can remain undocumented for far longer than we assume. The forest is not done introducing itself. Western science has, for most of its engagement with the Amazon, operated on a baseline assumption that the forest was pristine wilderness, a vast, largely uninhabited environment that had existed in more or less its current state since long before human arrival. The last 30 years of archaeological and remote sensing research have systematically dismantled that assumption. The Amazon basin was not a wilderness. It was a garden. A managed, cultivated, densely inhabited landscape that supported civilizations of a scale and sophistication that colonial European accounts, when they bothered to record them at all, consistently failed to understand or believed impossible. Francisco de Orellana, who in 1541 became the first European to navigate the Amazon from the Andes to the Atlantic, reported passing through territories of continuous settlement for hundreds of kilometers, towns and cities lining the riverbanks, populations in the tens of thousands, agricultural systems of extraordinary productivity. His accounts were dismissed for centuries. The jungle that later European explorers found was empty. The cities were gone, the populations devastated by old-world diseases that had raced ahead of the explorers themselves, killing communities before Europeans ever arrived in person. What was actually the aftermath of one of history's great biological catastrophes, the collapse of Amazon basin populations following contact with European pathogens, was misread as evidence that those populations had never existed in the first place. The forest had reclaimed so quickly, so completely, that within a few generations it was as if the cities Orellana had described had never stood. The evidence, however, had not vanished. It had only become invisible to eyes that did not know how to look. Terra preta, the remarkable dark, carbon-rich soil found in patches throughout the Amazon basin, is now understood to be the product of ancient human agriculture. This black earth, found in concentrations that correspond to former settlement sites, is extraordinarily fertile, far more so than the surrounding red laterite that dominates Amazonian soils. It was deliberately created through the incorporation of charcoal, bone, and organic matter over generations of habitation. It does not degrade. In many sites, it continues to support exceptional agricultural productivity thousands of years after the people who created it have vanished. Local farmers who work terra preta plots speak of it with the same reverence that the Yakumama tradition reserves for the serpent, as something given by ancestors whose understanding of the land exceeded anything the modern world has replicated. And scattered throughout the terra preta sites, in the pottery, the carved objects, the structural remains that occasionally surface during erosion events or low water seasons, are cultural materials whose style and construction suggest a level of social organization and artistic sophistication that continues to challenge assumptions about what life in the Amazon looked like before 1500. The geoglyphs of Acre, massive earthen geometric enclosures covering an area of nearly 2,000 square kilometers in the far western Brazilian state of Acre, near the Bolivian border, were invisible to ground-level observation for centuries. They were carved not from stone, but from earth. Ditches and embankments forming perfect circles, squares, and complex geometric combinations with diameters sometimes exceeding 200 meters. They were built beneath what was, at the time of their construction, dense forest, which means their builders had either cleared the forest to work or were constructing geometric patterns whose full form could only be appreciated from an altitude no person of the pre-Columbian Amazon could have physically achieved. This latter fact, the question of why a culture would construct forms visible only from the air, has generated significant academic discussion and considerably more speculation. The geoglyphs predate European contact by more than a millennium. Their function is not fully understood. Their builders have no confirmed cultural descendants who carry oral traditions about them. The possibility that the Amazon harbors additional undiscovered geoglyphs of comparable scale in regions where the forest has not been cleared and LiDAR surveys have not yet been conducted is considered highly likely by the researchers who work in this field. The basin covers approximately 5.5 million square kilometers. Comprehensive LiDAR coverage of even a significant fraction of that area would represent a scientific undertaking of extraordinary scale and cost. The surveys conducted so far have covered a vanishingly small portion of the total. What has already been found? Orellana's lost cities validated by geophysical data, the Llanos de Mojos hydraulic civilization, the Acre geoglyphs, the earthwork complexes of the Upper Xingu represents the first words of what may be a very long sentence. The rest of that sentence remains buried under a living roof that admits only what it chooses to, and still the serpent waits in that concealment. Not necessarily as a creature of supernatural dimensions, though the old traditions do not rule this out, but as a symbol of something the river systems of the Amazon have always known, and Western science is still in the process of learning, that the deep channels of this basin hold far more than has yet been named, measured, or understood. The green anaconda, in its confirmed biological reality, is already extraordinary enough to ground the legend without needing exaggeration. Females of the species grow substantially larger than males, and the biomass of prey available in the flooded forests of the Amazon basin, capybara, tapir, caiman, large fish, creates conditions that theoretically support far larger animals than the confirmed record has so far documented. The Amazon River system contains thousands of kilometers of channels that have never been surveyed for their herpetological fauna. What maximum size this species might reach in the most resource-rich and least disturbed of those channels is a question that has not been and perhaps cannot currently be answered. In 1948, a petroleum company conducting aerial surveys over the lower Ucayali River in Peru reported photographs of what appeared to be an enormous anaconda, estimated from the air at approximately 20 meters, coiled on a sandbar. The photographs reportedly existed, but were never published. The company, apparently concerned about the effect on its survey workers' morale, and unwilling to invite scientific scrutiny that might delay operations, suppressed the images. This account circulates in herpetological and cryptozoological literature with enough consistent detail to suggest it is not pure invention, but without the original photographs, it remains exactly what the Amazon prefers its secrets to remain: unverifiable. A Colombian biologist working in the late 1990s collected more than 30 independent indigenous testimonies from communities along the Caquetá River describing encounters with anacondas in the 15 to 20 meter range. The testimonies were strikingly consistent in their description of the animal's markings, behavior, and preferred habitat: deep channels at the confluences of Blackwater and Whitewater tributaries. The confluence point, where the dark, acidic water of a Blackwater tributary meets the lighter, sediment-rich flow of a Whitewater river, creates a unique ecological zone. The mixing of these chemically distinct water systems produces upwellings of nutrients and creates thermal gradients that concentrate fish populations. Large predatory fish aggregate at these confluences. Large predatory reptiles follow the fish. It is precisely the kind of environment that, in its biology, supports the kind of animal the indigenous testimonies describe. And it is also precisely the environment that is most difficult to survey, where deep channels and complex currents make systematic biological sampling nearly impossible. Fawcett would have known about these confluences. He had spent enough time on the rivers to understand their ecological logic, to read the water the way experienced river travelers learn to read landscapes. What he saw on the Abuna in 1907, whatever its actual dimensions, was enough to make him believe that the Amazon was operating by biological rules that European science had not yet written. And that conviction, combined with manuscript 512 and the indigenous accounts of a city in the interior, produced in him a certainty that outlasted his reputation, his relationships, his physical safety, and eventually his life. The lost city of Z was not, for Fawcett, a gold city in the conquistador tradition. He was not chasing treasure. He was chasing evidence, proof that the Amazon had once been home to a civilization sophisticated enough to have inspired the cultural memories that had filtered through 3 centuries of oral tradition into the documents he was reading. What we now know, largely because of work that has taken place in the centuries since Fawcett disappeared, is that he was, in fundamental principle, correct. The Amazon did harbor civilizations of urban scale and complexity. Those civilizations did leave physical evidence, evidence that was invisible to the surface surveys of Fawcett's era, but is now detectable through aerial and satellite remote sensing. The specific city he was looking for in the Mato Grosso highlands has not been confirmed, and the Serra do Roncador remains one of the least surveyed regions of the Brazilian interior. But the general principle, a sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization in the deep Amazon interior, is no longer questioned by mainstream archaeology. Fawcett was simply looking with the wrong tools in an era before the tools that could confirm his intuition existed. The forest had not yet chosen to reveal what it was hiding. The question of what happened to him remains the jungle's most elaborately guarded secret. Over the decades following his disappearance, more than a dozen expeditions entered the Mato Grosso, specifically to search for evidence of his fate. Several did not return their full complement of members. A Brazilian military officer named Grillo, who organized a search in 1928, lost several men to disease and indigenous conflict before retreating. A journalist named Albert de Winton, who made multiple attempts to trace Fawcett's route in the 1930s, vanished without trace in 1934. The forest was not merely indifferent to the searches, it seemed to actively resist them. Indigenous oral traditions collected by Brazilian anthropologists working with Xavante and Kalapalo communities in subsequent decades offered fragmentary and contradictory accounts. Some said the 3 men had been killed by a neighboring group after behaving in ways that violated local protocol. Some described the older man, unmistakably Fawcett, as having been seen alive and apparently healthy in a settlement deep in the interior, living among a community that had adopted him. Some described a clearing where 3 graves had been dug, though no one who claimed to know the location ever led a search party there. The bones that have been produced as potential remains, including a set of skeletal remains offered by a Kalapalo elder in the 1950s that were brought to England and examined, were determined not to match Fawcett's physical profile. The mystery absorbs all proposed solutions and gives none back. It behaves in this respect exactly as the Yakumama tradition says the great serpent behaves, not by destroying what comes near, but by simply refusing to release it. You'd never know. Hacking through the undergrowth of the Serra do Roncador on an ordinary day, that beneath your boots might lie the ruins of exactly what Fawcett gave his life to find. The soil keeps its own calendar. The roots keep their own records. And the forest has no obligation to share either with those who simply arrive and demand to know. Modern exploration technology has reached the Amazon with tools Fawcett could not have imagined. Airborne LIDAR, the laser-based terrain mapping that has already revealed the Acre geoglyphs and the Bolivian earthworks in such startling detail, is increasingly being applied to unexplored regions of the basin. In recent years, airborne laser mapping in other jungle regions of the Americas has revealed vast urban landscapes hidden beneath dense forest canopy. Discoveries that forced archaeologists to reconsider how much history can remain concealed under vegetation for centuries. The parallels for the Amazon are direct and sobering. If a single LIDAR survey of a portion of Guatemala can reveal 60,000 previously unknown structures beneath a forest that has been studied for over a century. What might comparable surveys of the Serra do Roncador reveal? What might they find in the flooded plains of Mato Grosso, in the highlands above the Rio Negro's source tributaries, in the territories that are, by Brazilian law, restricted from survey without indigenous consent, territories where uncontacted peoples live their complete lives in the shade of secrets that the outside world has not yet earned the right to know? The question of indigenous protection of sacred sites introduces a dimension of the Amazon's secrecy that is not simply about forest density or logistical difficulty. There are communities in the Amazon, particularly in the Javari Valley and in areas of the Upper Xingu, that have maintained voluntary isolation from the outside world, not because they are unaware of its existence, but because they have made a considered cultural decision that contact is not in their interest. The Brazilian government's Fundação Nacional do Índio, FUNAI, maintains a policy of non-contact with these groups, monitoring their territories by aerial observation and responding to incursions with legal action. This policy represents the hard-learned lesson of history. Every previous contact between isolated Amazon communities and the outside world has resulted in catastrophic population loss. The pathogens that devastated Orellana's densely settled river civilizations continue to be lethal to immune systems that have had no exposure to them. Within these protected territories, it is known from the limited and carefully managed contact that occurs at territorial boundaries, that some isolated communities maintain cultural practices, material technologies, and knowledge systems that have no documented parallel in the outside world. Botanical knowledge, in particular, is recognized by researchers as representing an intellectual patrimony of incalculable value. The pharmacological potential of Amazonian plant species, the fraction of that potential that has been formally investigated, has already produced compounds that are now central to treatments for conditions ranging from certain cancers to cardiovascular disease to the neurological disorders that Western medicine is still struggling to address. The plant knowledge held by communities that have had no contact with outside researchers, knowledge accumulated across potentially hundreds of generations of observation, experiment, and refinement, represents a library that cannot be accessed by any satellite survey or remote sensing technique. It exists entirely in human memory, in oral tradition, in the living practice of communities that are not lost but simply, deliberately elsewhere. The Yanomami, whose territory spans the highlands of northern Brazil and southern Venezuela, an area covering nearly 200,000 square kilometers, maintain one of the most sophisticated oral ethnobotanical traditions known to anthropology. Their knowledge of the plants of this highland forest region, how to prepare them, how to combine them, what conditions they address, what contraindications require avoidance, represents centuries of empirical observation conducted in one of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems. And embedded within that knowledge, transmitted through the shamanic traditions that connect the living community to its ancestral knowledge holders, are accounts of the great serpent, not as myth, not as warning fable, as ecological reality, as a feature of the landscape, as concrete, as the highland rivers and the game trails and the seasonal movements of the peccary herds. The Yanomami have been saying the same thing about the waters of their territory for as long as their oral traditions extend backward in time. Western science struggles to account for the consistency of such traditions across communities that have had no documented contact with each other. When the same animal, described with the same anatomical proportions, the same behavioral patterns, the same preferred habitat, appears in independent oral traditions separated by hundreds of kilometers and cultural boundaries that have historically prevented communication, The standard academic response is to propose convergent mythologizing. Similar environments produce similar imaginative responses, but this explanation has a limit. Convergent mythologizing can account for the presence of a giant serpent figure in many cultures. It has more difficulty accounting for the specific, consistent, technically precise anatomical details, the measurements, the coloration patterns, the behavioral specifics that independent testimonies share without any mechanism of cultural transmission. At some point, the simpler explanation becomes worth considering, that the traditions are consistent because what they describe is real. The Amazon is 5.5 million square kilometers of the least surveyed terrain on Earth. 90% of its interior has never been subject to systematic scientific survey of any kind. Its rivers change course between seasons. An oxbow lake that exists in the dry season becomes a connected waterway in the wet season, creating new channels and eliminating others in a constant renegotiation of the hydrological map. Areas that are accessible in one year may be completely inundated and unreachable the next. The forest floor itself is one of the most active biological recycling environments on the planet. A clearing cut into Amazonian forest will, within 12 months, show dense secondary growth that makes the clearing difficult to identify from aerial observation. Within 5 years, the primary forest structure begins to reassert itself. Within a generation, the clearing is essentially invisible. This means that surface evidence of temporary human activity, an expedition camp, a small clearing, a series of shelters, disappears from the Amazonian landscape with a speed that makes the concept of leaving a trace almost meaningless. Percy Fawcett's camp, wherever it stood in those final days of May 1925, has been gone from the surface of the Earth for longer than most living people have been alive. What the roots have taken, the roots will not return, and yet beneath that surface, in the terra preta layers that mark the passage of human habitation, the record endures. Not accessible to the casual explorer, not visible on any current map, but there, waiting, as the forest has always waited, for the right question to be asked in the right language. Something is out there. That much, the science now confirms without qualification. Not necessarily a city of gold in the conquistador fantasy. That particular legend has always said more about European desire than Amazonian reality. But cities of stone and earth and carefully engineered soil, cities that managed water with the precision of the greatest hydraulic civilizations of the ancient world. Cities that supported populations in the hundreds of thousands and left behind a transformed landscape that, even abandoned for 5 centuries, remains visibly different from the surrounding forest floor. And in the deep channels of the rivers that surrounded those cities, in the Blackwater tributaries where no scientific vessel has yet anchored and no systematic herpetological survey has been conducted, the largest snake species on Earth continues to live its unhurried life in conditions of near-perfect isolation, growing, it is reasonable to assume, to sizes that the confirmed record has not yet had occasion to document. The Yakumama does not need to be supernatural to be extraordinary. The forest does not need to be magical to be mysterious. Both are, in their documented biological and archaeological reality, already beyond what most of the world has yet fully reckoned with. The question is not whether something remarkable lurks beneath the Amazon's living roof. The question is simply what exactly it is, and whether the forest will ever choose to let us know. Fawcett believed the Amazon was trying to tell him something. He followed that belief to the end of the last map and beyond, into a silence the jungle has maintained for a century now, as patient and absolute as the Blackwater rivers that coil through it on their slow journey to the sea. The Amazon keeps its secrets beneath a living roof no satellite fully penetrates. Perhaps the great serpent still coils in channels where no research vessel has anchored. Perhaps the stones of Z still lie a foot beneath the forest floor of the Serra do Roncador, waiting for a route to finally shift them into the light. Perhaps that is how it should be. Or perhaps, one day, the forest will choose to reveal what it has hidden for millennia. And when it does, what it shows us will rewrite everything we thought we knew about who built this world and what swam its oldest rivers. If you're drawn to the mysteries that maps can't mark and science can't yet explain, join us as we trace every whisper the rainforest allows to escape. Subscribe to Secrets of the Amazon Jungle and venture deeper into what the forest has spent 10,000 years learning to keep.